For 35 years, I've worked as a truck driver, and in that time, the road has provided an endless source of stories. Some are humorous, some heartwarming, but others are chilling in ways that stay with you long after the engine has been turned off. Strangely enough, the most harrowing experience of my life didn't happen while I was on the job, hauling goods across the country. No, it happened on a seemingly innocent drive home from a family vacation. That trip, meant to be a time of relaxation and joy, became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It all began after a much-needed family vacation at the beach. My wife, our 2 children, and I had spent a week enjoying the sun, sand, and sea. It was a rare treat for me, considering the nature of my work. I'm away from home for most of the year, crisscrossing the nation, delivering cargo. That week was a slice of paradise. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. It was time to pack up and head back home. We woke early on the day of our departure, gathered our things, and packed our van. The small hotel staff came out to see us off, wishing us well and thanking us for staying. They had treated us like family during our stay, and we left with warm hearts and a suitcase full of memories. The drive home would take about 14 hours, but we weren't in a rush. As a family, we enjoyed stopping in small towns along the way to take pictures, buy souvenirs, and sample the local cuisine. It was our little tradition, a way to make even the long journey part of the vacation. By the time night fell, we were cruising down the interstate, the van's headlights cutting through the darkness. My wife was dozing in the passenger seat, and my 2 teenagers, Javier and Amanda, were in the back, engrossed in their phones. The radio played softly, a mix of old songs that I hummed along to, trying to keep myself alert. It was around 10 p.m. when we approached a farming town. The road ahead almost deserted, save for the occasional vehicle passing in the opposite direction. That's when I saw it. The blinding headlights of a vehicle in my rearview mirror, barreling toward us at an alarming speed. The lights grew brighter and closer, and my instincts kicked in. Years of experience on the road taught me to trust my gut, and I swerved to the side just in time. The vehicle, a blue Silverado pickup truck, whizzed past us, missing my van by mere inches. The force of its speed rocked our vehicle, and my wife jolted awake, screaming in fright. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, clutching the dashboard. "I don't know," I muttered, my heart pounding. "But that guy's a damn lunatic." Javier and Amanda, wide-eyed in the back seat, confirmed they were unharmed, though visibly shaken. I pulled over to the side of the road to collect myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to calm my racing heart. The Silverado had come so close to us that I could see the paint job glinting under the streetlights, but it was gone now, swallowed by the night. After a few minutes, I decided it was safe to continue. We hadn't gone more than a few kilometers when we encountered a traffic jam. A sea of red taillights stretched before us. The vehicles ahead stopped on the road. I parked on the shoulder and told my wife and kids to stay in the van while I went to see what was causing the delay. The sight that greeted me as I approached the scene sent a chill down my spine. A blue Silverado pickup truck lay off the side of the road, twisted into a mangled heap of metal. The high speed at which it had been traveling made it unrecognizable. Nearby, a body lay on the ground, covered with a blanket or tarp, while a small crowd of onlookers stood by, their faces pale and somber. But the carnage didn't end there. A few meters further down the road was another vehicle, a black Ford Focus, equally wrecked. It had been struck with such force that it had rolled over multiple times, leaving debris scattered across the road. Next to it were 4 more bodies, each shrouded in makeshift coverings, silent witnesses to the tragedy. As I moved closer to the Focus, something caught my eye, a small foot protruding from the wreckage. My stomach churned as I realized there was still someone inside. I called out to the other onlookers, urging them to help. Together, we began to sift through the twisted metal, desperate to reach the occupant. It was a little girl, no older than 5. Her small frame was lifeless, her dark hair matted with blood. We laid her gently next to what I assumed were her family members, and I couldn't hold back my tears. She looked so much like my own daughter at that age. My hands trembled as I brushed her hair from her face, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and helplessness. The ambulance arrived shortly after, but there was nothing they could do. The entire family had perished in the crash. I returned to my van, my heart heavy and my mind racing. My wife and kids listened in stunned silence as I recounted what I had seen. We all shared the same unspoken thought. That could have been us. The rest of the drive home was eerily quiet. The jovial atmosphere from earlier in the day was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Even when we arrived home, none of us spoke. My wife made coffee, knowing it would help calm my nerves while I went upstairs to shower. The image of the little girl haunted me. Her face was etched into my memory, a permanent reminder of how fragile life can be. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror drying my face, something caught my attention. In the reflection, just behind me, stood the little girl. Her dark hair fell over her face, and she stared at me with an intensity that froze me in place. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. She was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of the stress and exhaustion from the day's events. But that night, as I lay in bed, the nightmare began. I awoke to the sound of a child humming, a soft, eerie melody that sent chills down my spine. My body was paralyzed, unable to move or scream. I turned my eyes toward the foot of the bed, and there she was. The little girl stood in the darkness, humming that haunting tune, her gaze locked onto mine. Slowly, she began to climb onto the bed. I could feel her weight pressing down on my legs as she crawled up my body. Her touch was ice cold, and a sharp pain shot through my chest as she reached my chest and rested her head there. I struggled to breathe, the pain intensifying as her presence grew heavier. When she finally lifted her head to meet my eyes, her face was grotesque, pale, with hollow black pits where her eyes should have been. A sinister smile spread across her lips and my breath stopped altogether. I woke up gasping, clutching my chest. My wife stirred beside me, alarmed by my state, but there was no way to explain what I had just experienced. The stabbing pain in my chest lingered, and I feared I was having a heart attack. Paramedics arrived quickly and assured me it was likely a panic attack, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. The nightmares continued in the days that followed. Every night she returned climbing onto my bed, her chilling song echoing in my ears. And it didn't stop there. I began seeing her during the day, standing in corners, watching me from the shadows. Her presence was everywhere, suffocating and relentless. When I returned to work a few weeks later, I hoped the routine would help me regain a sense of normalcy. But during my first trip, as I drove down the highway, the same song began to play on the radio. My blood ran cold as I turned to see her sitting in the passenger seat. My panic caused me to swerve, narrowly avoiding a fatal collision. That night I couldn't return home. Instead, I went to my parents' house and confided in my father, who had also been a truck driver. He listened intently, then handed me a pendant of Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. It was adorned with tiger's eye beads, said to ward off evil. My father believed that my encounter with the girl's body had opened a door, allowing her spirit, or something far darker, to attach itself to me. From the moment I wore the pendant, the nightmares ceased. The girl no longer appeared, and the oppressive weight lifted. 10 years have passed since that night, but the memory lingers. I still wear the pendant every day, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing my sanity and my life. When my younger sister graduated from high school, my mother and I decided to surprise her with a long-awaited vacation to Puerto Vallarta. It was meant to be a celebration, a chance to bond and unwind as a family. Ours is a small family of 3, my mother, my sister, and me. My father had passed away when my sister and I were very young, and since then, my mother dedicated herself entirely to raising us. She worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs, and while she had a few relationships over the years, she never remarried. It had always been just the three of us, and this trip felt like a special reward for all the sacrifices we had made as a family. We had been planning the vacation for months, counting down the days with excitement. We envisioned sunny beaches, delicious food, and laughter-filled days. But when the day to leave finally arrived, everything seemed to go wrong. The setbacks began early. First, my sister misplaced her ID, sending the household into a frenzy as we tore through drawers, bags, and even the trash in search of it. After what felt like an eternity, we found it wedged between the couch cushions. Then, just as we were about to sit down for breakfast, my mother accidentally cut her hand while chopping tomatoes. Blood seeped from the gash, and we had to stop everything to bandage it properly. And if that wasn't enough, as we finally got ready to hit the road, we discovered a flat tire on the car. Frustrated but determined, I went to retrieve the spare, only to realize it was missing. I ended up taking a cab into town to buy not just one, but 2 tires. There was no way I was going on a long road trip without a backup. By the time everything was resolved, we were leaving hours later than planned. I took the wheel, anxious to make up for lost time. Driving long distances wasn't new to me, but I'd always had a fear of driving at night. Unfortunately, our delays left me no choice. The hotel room was already booked, and we couldn't afford to waste another day. So, with the sun already dipping below the horizon, we set off, determined to make it to Puerto Vallarta. As night fell, I pushed forward, trying to cover as much ground as possible. The road stretched endlessly before us, illuminated only by the glow of the headlights. My mother sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, while my sister dozed in the back seat. I kept my eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at the dashboard. The gas gauge was creeping toward empty, and my heart sank when I realized we had less than half a tank left. Luckily, a gas station was just 20 minutes away, or so I thought. When we arrived, the station was closed, its pumps lifeless. My stomach twisted with worry. We pulled over and consulted the map on my phone, searching for the nearest station. The closest one was over an hour away, farther than I was comfortable driving on what little gas we had left. As panic began to set in, I spotted another station on the map, just 30 minutes away. The catch? It was in a small, remote town that required us to take a dirt road off the main highway. I hesitated, weighing the risks, but we didn't have much choice. Running out of gas in the middle of the night seemed far worse. We turned off the highway and onto the dirt road. The moment we did, a sense of unease settled over me. The road was narrow, uneven, and flanked by dense trees on both sides. Shadows danced in the glow of our headlights, and the crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove cautiously, trying not to think about how isolated we were. The farther we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The darkness seemed to deepen, and an inexplicable dread gnawed at the edges of my mind. My mother, usually a source of calm, was uncharacteristically quiet. My sister, sensing the tension, sat upright, her eyes scanning the trees outside. After what felt like an eternity, the faint glow of lights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me. Finally, the town. But just as we began to relax, something caught our attention. Ahead of us, on the road, was a procession of people. At first it was hard to make out details, but as we got closer, we saw that they were dressed in black and moving slowly toward the town. Their somber pace and attire gave the impression of a funeral procession. "It's strange for something like this to happen so late at night," my mother murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I agreed, but I rationalized it, thinking it might be a local tradition. Despite the eeriness of the sight, we decided to follow the procession, assuming it would lead us to the town. I slowed the car, keeping a respectful distance as the group moved ahead. Minutes passed, and the procession showed no sign of speeding up. I began to grow uneasy again, the oppressive feeling from earlier returning with a vengeance. Then, in the rearview mirror, I noticed headlights approaching. The lights flickered on and off as if signaling to us. At first, I thought it was someone trying to pass, but the road was too narrow for that. As the vehicle got closer, I realized it was an old pickup truck. The driver stopped abruptly, got out, and began waving his arms frantically, running toward us. Alarmed, I pulled over and rolled down the window. The man's face was etched with urgency and fear. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Do you want to die?" My heart nearly stopped. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. The man pointed ahead. "Look." I turned my gaze back to the road and my blood turned to ice. The procession was gone. So was the road. Just a few meters ahead was a massive ravine, the edge barely visible in the moonlight. Beyond it was nothing but a sheer drop into a rocky riverbed below. My hands trembled as I stepped out of the car to see for myself. The cliff was enormous, at least 10 meters deep, and the jagged rocks at the bottom seemed to gleam menacingly in the dark. I turned to the man, my voice shaking. "What about the procession? The people we were following?" He stared at me, baffled. "What procession?" "There's no one here." My mother and sister got out of the car, their faces pale. We recounted what we had seen, but the man was adamant. "You left the road about a kilometer back. I've lived here my whole life. That path leads nowhere but to this ravine. You were driving on brush and rocks. You should have seen the edge long before now." I couldn't explain it. None of us could. The man, a local from a nearby town, escorted us back to the main road and stayed with us until we reached the gas station. That night, we decided to stay at an inn in the village. I couldn't bring myself to drive any farther in the dark. Even now, I can't make sense of what happened. The memory still sends chills down my spine. If that man hadn't appeared when he did, we would have driven straight off the cliff. I'll never forget the haunting image of that procession, or the inexplicable terror that gripped us that night. Whatever it was something beyond our understanding, and it almost cost us our lives. My name is Carlos, and the story I'm about to share is the most harrowing experience of my life. Even after 14 years, I still have nightmares about that night. It's a memory that lingers, etched in my mind like a scar I can't escape. I was 22 years old at the time, and life seemed simpler, ordinary even. I had recently started dating a girl named Paula, a kind and compassionate soul who lived in a small, quiet town about an hour outside the city. Despite the distance, I didn't mind driving out to see her. Paula was worth every kilometer. Her laugh, her warmth, and her genuine nature made the long drives feel like a small price to pay. Her town was isolated, reachable only by a single dirt road that seemed to wind endlessly through stretches of barren land and dense patches of forest. I never thought much of it then, but that road would come to haunt me in ways I could never have imagined. One Saturday, Paula called me with a request. Her cousins were visiting from another state, and she wanted to take them out to see the city. She asked if I could drive them. I agreed without hesitation. Spending the day with Paula was always a treat, and I was eager to make a good impression on her family. I arrived at Paula's house in the late afternoon. She greeted me with her radiant smile, and her cousins, 2 young women around our age, seemed excited about the trip. After introductions and a few lighthearted jokes, we piled into my car, Paula in the passenger seat and her cousins in the back. The day was perfect. We toured the city, visiting parks, local attractions, and a few popular spots that showcased its vibrant culture. By evening, we found ourselves at a well-known nightclub. The music was loud, the energy electric, and for hours, we danced and laughed, losing ourselves in the joy of the moment. It wasn't until 3:30 in the morning that we decided to call it a night. The city had started to quiet down, and the streets were nearly empty as we made our way back to Paula's town. I was tired but sober enough to drive, having limited myself to just a couple of drinks. The road leading to her town was as desolate as ever. The trees on either side loomed like shadowy sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. The only sound was the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. Paula's cousins chatted quietly in the back seat, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone on this isolated stretch of road. About halfway to the town, the monotony was broken by the sudden appearance of headlights in the distance. A pickup truck was speeding toward us, its engine roaring as it hurtled down the narrow road. It zipped past us in a blur, so fast that I barely caught a glimpse of it. "That's odd," Paula said, turning to watch the truck's taillights vanish into the darkness. "I've never seen that truck in town before." "Maybe it's someone passing through," I suggested, though the sight unsettled me more than I let on. We continued on, the road growing rougher with each passing kilometer. About 200 meters later, something else caught our attention. On the side of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights, were several black garbage bags scattered haphazardly. I slowed down, instinctively cautious. The last thing I wanted was to run over something that could damage the car. "Stop the car," Paula said suddenly, her voice tense. "Why?" I asked, puzzled. "One of those bags. It moved," she said, her eyes wide with alarm. "What are you talking about?" "I saw it move, Carlos. Please stop." I hesitated, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Paula was serious, and I could see the concern etched on her face. Reluctantly, I pulled over. "Stay here," I said as I unbuckled my seatbelt, though Paula was already opening her door. "No way. If it's an animal, we have to help," she insisted. Her determination left no room for argument, so we both got out, leaving her cousins in the car. The moment we stepped onto the road, a rancid stench hit us like a physical blow. It was the smell of decay, pungent, putrid, and suffocating. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my hand. "What the hell is that?" Paula whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, though dread was already pooling in my stomach. We approached the bags cautiously, the beams from the car's headlights casting long, eerie shadows. There were 5 bags in total, all tied tightly at the top. The middle one was the one Paula claimed had moved. As I got closer, my heart pounded in my chest. The stench was overpowering, and an unshakable sense of dread settled over me. I nudged the middle bag with my foot, half expecting something to lunge out. Nothing happened. "I think it's dead," I said, glancing at Paula. "Check it," she urged. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car and drive away, but Paula's pleading eyes pushed me forward. I reached into my pocket for the multi-tool I always carried and carefully slit the bag open. What I saw inside will haunt me forever. Human remains, severed limbs, twisted and grotesque, spilled out of the bag. Hands, feet, forearms. The pale, lifeless flesh glistened under the headlights. Paula let out a blood-curdling scream and stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. She turned and ran toward the car, her footsteps echoing in the still night. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as I stared at the macabre contents of the bag. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out everything else. My mind raced, struggling to process the horror before me. "Carlos!" someone yelled, shaking me violently. It was one of Paula's cousins. "We have to go. Now. What if they come back?" The mention of they snapped me out of my trance. The pickup truck, the one that had sped past us earlier. My blood ran cold at the thought. Whoever had done this might still be nearby. I stumbled back to the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door handle. I started the engine and floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as we sped away. The drive back to Paula's house was a blur. My mind raced with questions, none of which I wanted answered. Who had left those bags there? Why? And had Paula really seen one of them move? When we finally reached her house, we told her parents everything. Their faces paled as we recounted the night's events. Paula's father immediately called the police, who arrived within the hour. By the time we returned to the scene with the authorities, dawn was breaking. The golden light of morning did little to dispel the terror that clung to the air. The officers inspected the bags, their grim expressions confirming our worst fears. Later, we learned from the news that the remains belonged to members of a criminal gang. The killings were part of a brutal vendetta carried out by a rival group. The road we had taken was likely used as a dumping ground for the grisly aftermath. The revelation brought little comfort. The images of that night were seared into my memory, and the nightmares began almost immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those severed limbs, pale and lifeless, staring back at me from the darkness. For months, Paula and I struggled to move past what had happened. The road that once symbolized the connection between us became a source of fear and anxiety. Eventually, we decided to move to the city together, hoping a fresh start would help us heal. Even now, the memory lingers. It's a reminder of how quickly life can shift from ordinary to unimaginable, and how sometimes the darkness of the world is closer than we think. My name is Anna Maria, and I am a pediatrician. My work often brings me moments of joy, the kind that stays with you forever. But on rare occasions, it also exposes you to the fragility of life in ways that can haunt you. This story is not about the joys of my profession, though. It is about the most chilling and heart-wrenching experience of my life. To this day, I find it hard to speak of that night without trembling. It was a night that left an indelible mark on my soul. A night when reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving behind a haunting memory. The events I am about to recount took place in 2013, when I was 31 years old. I had been assigned to a volunteer program that provided medical services to underserved communities. The destination was a small coastal town called Las Pitas, an isolated village surrounded by the sea on one side and vast agricultural fields on the other. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, where life moved at a slower, simpler pace. The original plan was for me to travel with a team of doctors on a bus that left early that morning. Unfortunately, an emergency at the hospital I worked for delayed me, and I missed the bus. Missing the bus was not an option for me, as I had committed to spending 15 days in Las Pitas, offering medical care to children and families in need. Determined to fulfill my obligation, I asked my father if he could drive me there. Knowing it was an 8-hour journey, I also asked my younger brother, Daniel, to accompany us. Daniel was 20 at the time, and I thought his presence would be comforting for my father on the return trip. He agreed without hesitation, and we set out later that afternoon. We finally left the house at 3 p.m., far later than I had hoped. I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. I knew that driving through rural roads late at night could be risky. These were roads where cell phone signals were weak, the pavement was cracked and uneven, and you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. My father's vision wasn't the best at night either, which added another layer of worry. Still, I tried to focus on the positives. I was with my family, and we had each other for company. The first few hours of the trip were pleasant. My father kept us entertained with his endless jokes and stories from his youth, stories I had heard a dozen times but still laughed at. Daniel and I took turns picking music, filling the car with a mix of upbeat tunes and nostalgic classics. The scenery outside was breathtaking, lush green hills, quaint villages with colorful houses, and the occasional stretch of coastline where the ocean seemed to glimmer under the fading sunlight. For a while, the beauty of the journey made me forget my earlier anxieties. As the hours passed, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness began to settle in. By the time we reached the last of the fishing villages, it was past 10 p.m. The air felt cooler, and the road ahead was shrouded in shadows. We left the coastal highway and entered an agricultural area, a long stretch of road bordered by vast empty fields. Here, the silence was almost palpable, broken only by the hum of our car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the endless expanse of farmland under a moonlit sky. It was on this desolate stretch of road that we first saw her. At first, it was just a small figure in the distance, barely discernible against the darkness. As we drew closer, the figure became clearer, a little girl, no older than 7, riding a bicycle. Her hair flowed behind her in the night breeze, and her white dress seemed to glow faintly in the headlights. She pedaled steadily, her small frame silhouetted against the emptiness of the road. For a moment, the three of us were silent, each processing what we were seeing. Then Daniel broke the silence with a half-joking comment. "Well, there you have it," he said, leaning forward in his seat. "The classic ghost girl on a deserted road." I rolled my eyes, but deep down I felt a chill run through me. There was something unsettling about the sight of the girl, something that didn't quite make sense. What was she doing here, all alone, at this hour? The nearest village was miles away, and there was no sign of a house nearby. As we approached, the car's headlights illuminated her face. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. The sudden glare seemed to startle her, and she lost control of the bicycle. With a small yelp, she tumbled to the ground, landing in the middle of the road. "Stop the car!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. My father hit the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The sound of tires skidding on asphalt echoed through the night. But before any of us could move, the deep, guttural roar of a truck engine filled the air. My heart dropped as I turned my head to see the headlights of a massive truck speeding toward us. Its horn blared, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking with desperation. The truck didn't slow down. It thundered past us, its enormous wheels rolling over the spot where the girl had fallen. The impact I expected to hear never came, but the sight of those monstrous wheels passing over her tiny frame left me paralyzed. We all sat frozen in our seats, our breaths caught in our throats. As the truck disappeared into the darkness, the three of us bolted out of the car and ran to the spot where the girl had fallen. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own footsteps. But when we reached the place where she had been, there was nothing. No girl, no bicycle, no blood. The road was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. We stood there, our eyes scanning the road and the surrounding fields. The car's headlights illuminated the area perfectly, leaving no shadows for anyone or anything to hide in. And yet she was gone. Before we could process what had just happened, we heard the distant hum of another engine. Turning toward the sound, we saw a tractor approaching from the opposite direction. It was moving slowly, its dim headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, brought the vehicle to a stop and climbed down. He walked toward us with an air of familiarity, as though he already knew why we were standing there. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said, his voice calm but somber. We exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. "Don't bother looking for her," the man continued. "She's not real. Neither is the truck." His words sent a shiver down my spine. My father, always the rational one, stepped forward. "What do you mean she's not real?" he asked. "We all saw her. She was right here." The man nodded, his expression tinged with sadness. "You're not the first to see her. Almost everyone who travels this road at night sees her at least once." "But who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man gestured for us to follow him. Reluctantly, we did, walking a short distance to a cluster of bushes on the side of the road. He pushed aside the branches, revealing a small hidden chapel. Inside, a tiny plaster angel sat atop a weathered altar. Beneath it was a metal cross, surrounded by the remnants of candles and wilted flowers. A plaque on the altar bore the name of the girl, along with 2 dates, her birth and her death, April 17th, 1997. "She was the daughter of a farming couple," the man explained. "She loved riding her bike and would often venture onto the road in the afternoons. One day, a truck came speeding down this road and hit her. She died instantly." A lump formed in my throat as I imagined the scene. The innocence of a child shattered in an instant, the grief of her parents, losing their daughter in such a tragic way. And now, the inexplicable reality that her spirit seemed to linger here, trapped in an endless cycle of her final moments. Why does she still appear?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. The man shrugged. Some say it's because her soul is restless. Others think it's a warning, a reminder to drive carefully on these roads. Whatever the reason, she's been here for as long as I can remember. He left us with those words, climbing back into his tractor and driving off into the night. We returned to the car, our earlier lightheartedness replaced by a heavy silence. The rest of the journey was uneventful, but the memory of that night has never left me. Even now, years later, I think of her often. I pray for her soul, hoping she finds peace. But a part of me wonders if she will always be there, waiting on that lonely road, reliving her tragic fate over and over. For the past 5 years, I've worked at a warehouse located 2 hours away from my city. The job pays well enough to provide for my wife and 3 children, but the commute has always been a grueling test of endurance and nerves. The roads I travel daily are notorious for their dangers. Crime is rampant in the area, with gangs often targeting lone vehicles, especially at night. Accidents are another constant hazard, often involving the massive trucks that dominate these industrial routes. Every day I steel myself for the journey, praying for safe passage as I leave home before sunrise and return just after sunset. It's a routine I've come to accept, one that I carefully plan to avoid the worst dangers. I make sure to leave the warehouse promptly at 5 p.m., giving myself enough time to reach home before the darkness fully sets in. By the time I pull into my driveway around 7:30 p.m., there's still a faint trace of light in the sky. It's a delicate balance, one that provides me with a fragile sense of security. But one night, that balance was shattered, and I came face to face with something I can barely explain, something that has haunted me ever since. That day began like any other. I arrived at the warehouse early, ready for another monotonous shift. By mid-afternoon, a problem with one of the machines threw the entire operation into chaos. A colleague had overlooked a critical maintenance task, and as a result, production came to a grinding halt. The supervisors were furious, and the rest of us were left scrambling to fix the issue. Tension hung heavy in the air as we worked overtime to restore order. It wasn't until nearly 8 p.m. that I was finally able to clock out. By then, the sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the warehouse parking lot was shrouded in shadows. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest as I climbed into my car. The thought of driving those perilous roads at night filled me with dread, but there was no alternative. My family was waiting for me at home, and I couldn't let my fears keep me from them. As I merged onto the road, the familiar landscape looked completely different under the moonlight. The bright, bustling industrial area I was used to during the day now seemed desolate and foreboding. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and the occasional headlights of passing trucks were like brief, flickering beacons in the darkness. The road was quieter than usual, the hum of engines and the occasional honk echoing into the vast emptiness around me. I clutched the steering wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of danger. The stories I'd heard over the years about this stretch of road played in my mind. Stories of robberies, kidnappings, and even worse. My heartbeat quickened every time I spotted a shadowy figure by the roadside or a slow-moving vehicle in the distance. After driving for about an hour, I reached the toll booth that marked the halfway point of my journey. It was a small, isolated structure, barely illuminated by a few flickering lights. This toll booth was a daily checkpoint for me, a place where I briefly interacted with the employees before continuing on my way. That night, however, something was different. I pulled up to the first booth where a young woman with long red hair was sitting. Her head was tilted slightly forward, and her eyes seemed to be staring blankly into the distance. The light inside the booth was dim, casting strange shadows across her face. She didn't look at me as I approached, nor did she react when I rolled down my window and greeted her. "Good evening," I said, my voice loud enough to be heard through the glass. She didn't respond. Her expression didn't change, and she didn't so much as glance in my direction. "Excuse me," I tried again, leaning slightly out of my window. "I need a ticket. Still, there was no reaction. Her stillness was unnerving, almost unnatural. For a moment, I considered honking the horn, but something about her vacant stare stopped me. It wasn't just disinterest. It was as if she wasn't really there, as if her mind was somewhere far away. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I glanced around and noticed a man at the farthest booth waving at me. He was gesturing for me to come over, his movements quick and urgent. Relieved to finally get some assistance, I gave him a quick nod and started my car. Before driving off, I looked back at the red-haired girl, intending to say something, perhaps a sarcastic remark about her lack of professionalism. But when I turned my head, she was gone. The booth was completely empty. My heart skipped a beat. The only door to the booth was on my side, and I had been parked there the entire time. There was no way she could have left without me seeing her. I craned my neck, searching for any sign of her outside, but the area around the booth was deserted. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to rationalize what I'd just seen, or hadn't seen. Shaking off the unease, I drove to the last booth, where the man was waiting. He greeted me with a polite nod and handed me my ticket. "Sorry about the inconvenience," he said. "This is the only booth operating at this hour." His words made me pause. "What about the first booth?" I asked. There was a girl there, but she wouldn't respond to me. The man's expression shifted. His smile faltered, and he gave me a strange look. "Girl," he repeated, his voice tinged with confusion. "Yes," I said. "A young woman with long red hair. She was sitting in the booth when I pulled up." His face turned pale, and he took a step back, as if my words had physically struck him. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a growing sense of dread. "Why? What's wrong?" He hesitated, glancing around nervously before leaning in closer. "2 weeks ago," he began, his voice low and cautious, "a girl who worked in that booth disappeared." He hesitated, glancing around nervously before leaning in closer. "2 weeks ago," he began, his voice low and cautious, "a girl who worked in that booth disappeared. She fit the description you just gave. Long red hair, young, always polite to drivers. She was kidnapped right there in broad daylight by a gang. They dragged her into a van and drove off. No one has seen or heard from her since." I stared at him, unable to speak. "After that," he continued, "the other girl who worked here quit. She was terrified the same thing would happen to her. That booth hasn't been used since." A cold wave of fear washed over me. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process what he was saying. If what he told me was true, then the girl I had seen could not have been alive. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced with questions and possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it her spirit, lingering at the place where she had been taken? Was she trying to communicate something? Or was she simply trapped, unable to move on? I thanked the man and drove off, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of fear and sorrow. The rest of the journey was a blur. Every shadow seemed to move. Every distant light felt like a pair of watching eyes. The road, which I had traveled countless times before, now felt foreign and menacing. When I finally pulled into my driveway, it was nearly midnight. My wife met me at the door, her face etched with worry. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. How could I tell her that I had seen a ghost, that the girl in the booth might still be waiting for someone to find her, to bring her justice? That night, I couldn't sleep. The girl's vacant stare haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about her family, about the agony they must be enduring, not knowing whether she was alive or dead. And then, there was the chilling thought that perhaps she wasn't the only one. How many others had been taken on that cursed road, their spirits lingering in the shadows? The next morning, I considered reporting what I had seen to the authorities, but I hesitated. Would they even believe me? Or would they dismiss it as the ramblings of an overworked man? In the end, I decided to keep the experience to myself. But every time I pass that toll booth, I feel a shiver of unease, as if someone, or something, is watching me. Even now, years later, I can't forget that night. It's a memory that refuses to fade, a reminder of the fragility of life and the mysteries that linger just beyond our understanding. My name is Armando, and for over 15 years I've worked as a cab driver in the bustling city of Monterey. If there's one thing this job has taught me, it's that every night holds the potential for something extraordinary or terrifying. I've witnessed the chaos of drunken passengers, the raw emotion of late-night heartbreaks, and the quiet beauty of an empty city lit by neon signs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the night I met Helena Martin. It was 2018, a humid summer night. My shift had gone as usual, picking up passengers, listening to their stories, and trying to ignore the fatigue creeping in as the hours ticked by. By 11 p.m., I was ready to park my cab and call it a night. My small apartment in the heart of the city awaited me, along with the promise of a few precious hours of sleep before another long day. Just as I was about to head home, my phone buzzed. The name Frank flashed across the screen. Frank was an old friend, the kind of guy who could charm his way into or out of almost anything. He wasn't exactly reliable, but he was loyal in his way, and I owed him a favor or two. "Armando," he began, his voice dripping with urgency. "I need a huge favor." I sighed. "Frank, it's late. I'm done for the night. Come on, man. I met this girl on Tinder. She lives in a nice neighborhood, and I really need to see her tonight. You're my only option." I hesitated. Frank wasn't the best judge of character, and his plans often bordered on reckless. Still, he continued, "I'm broke right now, but I'll pay you double on payday." "Please." I rubbed my temples, torn between the exhaustion weighing down my body and the guilt of leaving him stranded. Against my better judgment, I caved. "Fine. Where am I taking you?" Frank rattled off the address, and I reluctantly made my way to his place. He hopped into the cab, his cologne filling the air with a sharp, woody scent. The ride to the woman's house was uneventful, though Frank's chatter about his date grated on my nerves. When we arrived at the upscale residential complex, I dropped him off and made arrangements to pick him up the next morning. By the time I left, it was midnight, the streets quieter than usual. The city's hum had dulled to a whisper, the neon lights casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. As I navigated the winding streets, my eyes caught something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing under a large tree near a gated residence. She was partially obscured by shadows, but her silhouette was unmistakable. She waved at me, beckoning me to stop. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but curiosity, or perhaps a sense of obligation, got the better of me. I reversed the cab until I was beside her. She was tall, with long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore a loose-fitting white dress, almost like a robe that fluttered slightly in the night breeze. Her bare arms were pale, and a red silk scarf was tied tightly around her neck. "Can I help you?" I asked, leaning out the window. She nodded, her voice soft and melodic. "Can you take me to the Alta Vista neighborhood?" Her request surprised me. Alta Vista was on the other side of the city, a solid hour and a half away, even with light traffic. "It's a long drive," I said cautiously. "I'll pay you well," she replied, her green eyes meeting mine. There was something in her gaze, something hollow and distant. Reluctantly, I agreed, gesturing for her to get in. She settled into the back seat, her movements graceful yet deliberate. As I adjusted the rearview mirror to glance at her, I noticed how still she was. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Her silence filled the cab with an uncomfortable tension. I tried to make conversation, asking where she was headed or if she lived in Alta Vista. Her responses were brief, almost robotic, as if she were reciting lines from a script. Eventually, I gave up and turned on the radio, hoping the music would ease the strange atmosphere. The highway stretched ahead of us, dark and seemingly endless. The occasional streetlight cast fleeting beams of light into the cab, illuminating her face for split seconds. Her features were striking, but there was an air of sadness about her, as though she carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. About 20 minutes into the drive, as we passed a densely wooded area, she spoke for the first time in what felt like ages. "Can you pull over?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Why?" I asked, glancing at her through the mirror. "I need you to drive into the woods," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't do that." She didn't argue. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, her white dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Wait!" I called out, but she didn't respond. She walked into the woods, her figure disappearing among the trees. For a moment, I was frozen. My mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. What if she was in danger? What if this was a setup? The darkness seemed to close in around me, the silence pressing against my ears. Finally, fear won. I shifted into reverse, my headlights briefly illuminating the forest. She was gone. The drive back to the city was agonizing. My thoughts spiraled, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was she? Why had she wanted to go into the woods? And why had she seemed so otherworldly? The following days were a blur of confusion and unease. I couldn't shake the image of her pale face, her vacant eyes, the way she had walked into the darkness without hesitation. Then, about a week later, everything became horrifyingly clear. I stopped at a cafe one morning to grab a coffee and a newspaper. As I sipped the steaming liquid, a headline on the front page caught my eye. "After 18 years, Helena Martin's remains discovered in local forest." My heart stopped. Beneath the headline was a photo of the woman I had picked up that night. According to the article, Helena Martin had been the wife of a prominent businessman, Ernesto Martin. She had disappeared in 2000, her case unsolved for nearly 2 decades. Her remains had been discovered in a shallow grave in the same woods where I had left her. The details were chilling. Ernesto, consumed by jealousy over suspected infidelity, had strangled her with her own red scarf before burying her in the forest. The same scarf I had seen her wearing that night. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't given a ride to a living woman. I had encountered the spirit of Helena Martin, still wandering, still searching for something, or someone, to bring her peace. For weeks, I avoided that part of the city, too afraid to go near the woods. But no matter how much time passes, her memory lingers. Her green eyes, her soft voice, the haunting silence that filled the cab. It's a part of me now, a reminder that some roads should never be traveled. Even as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she'll find her way back to me.